If you're familiar with 3D modeling, I want to let you know that you can create polygon objects in Cinema 4D Lite. However, most of the polygon editing tools are only available in the full version of Cinema 4D. So in Cinema 4D Lite, we're going to stick to the two main ways to model, using primitive objects or extruding spline objects. Let's take a look. In the project panel, you'll see I have one comp, and down here in my timeline, I have one Cinema 4D layer. So let's click on that layer and press Command-E or Control-E on Windows to edit the original. Once inside of Cinema 4D, I want to draw your attention to the Objects Manager here in the upper right-hand corner. You can see I have an extrude object, and the icon for that is green. That's because green objects are generator objects. It's generating geometry based upon the settings of this spline object, which I know looks remarkably similar to a path spline inside of Photoshop or Illustrator. So let's go ahead and select our extrude object. And I want to go over here to the middle column here because I want to draw your attention to how we can view models inside of Cinema 4D Lite. These little stoplight buttons, these two buttons over top of each other, control visibility of the object inside of the editor as well as the renderer. So if I double click on this top button, that'll change that red and it turns off the visibility of my extrude object and its child, because this is a visual hierarchy here. If I go to render the scene by clicking my render view, you can see the geometry still renders. If I want to turn it off in both the editor and the renderer, I have to turn off both buttons. So here, I'll double click on this bottom button here and render, and now you can see it's like it never existed. So let's go ahead and turn that off, and we're back to the default settings here. The next arrow here determines whether or not the process occurs for said object. So if I go ahead and just check that checkbox to make it an X, now I can actually see the child spline object here, and the extrude object is no longer generating geometry. So if I go to render this, you can see nothing is being rendered because spline objects have no geometry. We've seen how to extrude 3D geometry using splines with Illustrator files, but I want to show you how we can use some of the native splines inside of Cinema 4D Lite. So here, I'll turn the visibility off just in the editor for this extrude object for the time being, and let's just click in the bottom of the Objects Manager to deselect. Before I go create a spline object, I want to point out that this is a 2D object. So I want to click in the upper right-hand corner of our viewport here and switch to a flat view, which is also known as an orthogonal view. So let's go to the front view and click in that corner, and then we'll go up to our spline tools. It's the second little button here under my Create Tools. So if you click and hold, we have a bunch of preset splines, and we have freehand and Bezier splines. Now let's use one of the presets. I'll choose the star. Now, once you have a spline set up, you can change its attributes here in the attribute panel. So if I only wanted a 5-pointed star, I could just click through that and make a 5-point star. Now, if I want to actually create geometry for this, I need to extrude it. So I'm going to hold down the Option key or Alt on Windows, and I'll go to my generator objects, which are green, and I'll click and hold here. And when I choose the extrude object, since I'm holding Alt or Option, it automatically extrudes that spline by making it the child of the object. So here, if I go ahead and open up my perspective view, you can see now I've successfully created yet another 3D model. And if I click on my extrude object, you can see I have the same cap settings in my caps area that I had from my extruded Illustrator spline. It doesn't matter whether you actually merge an Illustrator document or create something natively, it's going to function in the same fashion. So if you want to delete a model, you just click on the top part of the hierarchy, so my extrude.1 file, and I'll just press delete, and that deletes. Now, there are a couple more things I want you to understand about the relationship between spline objects and extrude objects. So let's re-enable our extrude object and turn its visibility back on in the editor. If your model doesn't look like this, with this dark lines around the edges, I want you to go to the display options here and make sure you have Garud shading lines enabled. So now I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on my model, and I'll just move up to the corner here. And you can see as I get closer, the edges of this model are kind of jagged. To smooth this out, I need to make an adjustment to my spline object. So let's go up to our extrude object here and just turn off the generator for the time being. Select the spline object, and I want you to go to the left side of the interface. This area here controls the different kinds of geometry that you can select. By default, it's using model mode, but I want to go ahead and use points mode. This shows me the actual anchor points used to create these spline objects. So each one of these points controls how the spline looks, but there are intermediate points that also control things. So if I re-enable my extruded object here, and then click on my spline object, go to the object section of the attributes panel, and under intermediate points, notice it's set to adaptive. If I decrease the angle on adaptive, it'll actually increase the number of points used to create this curve. So notice the geometry gets a little more thick in key areas. So when I go ahead and render now, you can see I've got a more smoothed out edge. If you click on the pull down, there are other settings that you can definitely click through to see how they function. But all in all, if you need to smooth out your adjustments, you want to go to the intermediate points section to check things out. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here a little bit because I want to use a primitive object to add kind of a background to our surf zone logo. If I go up to my primitive objects, these are the blue objects. If I click and hold here, these objects are preset pieces of geometry. So let's start just by adding a cube. If I click on the cube here, notice it populates the center of my screen. Anytime you create a new model, it'll automatically propagate in the origin of your project, which is the center right here. I'm having a hard time seeing what's going on, so I'll turn the visibility of my extrude object off in the editor here. And then I'll switch my editing modes back to model mode. And see, in model mode here, I get access to my handles. So I can click on the handles to resize my object. I can also just make adjustments here in the attributes panel. So here, if I want this to actually be not quite as deep, I could click and drag on the up and down arrows to make that a little more narrow. Now, a cube object actually has depth. If I orbit around here, you can see it has depth. So I just want to create a flat plane. I'm going to go ahead and click on the cube and press delete. And let's go back up to our primitive objects, click and hold, and go to the plane. Let's change the orientation to +Z, and then turn the visibility of our extrude object back on so we can see our logo. And we can change the size of the plane by clicking on the orange dynamic controls and just dragging up and down. Then if we need to move this object around the scene, I can grab my move tool, hover over, say, the Z axis here, and push things back in the scene and bring it back till it just barely touches the logo. Now, if we render the scene, you can see we've actually created this extruded logo with an extrude object and a plane object. So let's click on the plane, drag it to the bottom of the layer hierarchy just so we can kind of keep things organized. And then we'll double click on the word extrude and call it logo to rename our scene. So now if we go ahead and press Command S, that'll go ahead and save the file. And if we go back into After Effects, you can see our new modeling information has been translated and we're ready to go.